Welcome everyone. I'm very pleased that the room is full, but it's no surprise because we have a very special guest today, Vijay Prashad, all the way from Berlin today.
Buchenwald.
Yes, he went to Buchenwald today to visit the former concentration camp. So before I introduce him, I was supposed to make some announcements. So there is an info stall where you can find the material of our organization of KO, but you can also find some material of Tricontinental, this brochure that Vijay is talking about today, but also some material from Zetkin Forum, the European representative of Tricontinental, if I'm not wrong. And there's also drinks and foods. Please leave a donation if you take something, feel free. And I just want to announce that on Thursday we will have a rally in support with Iran against the Zionist and US aggression against Iran. So please show up, please spread the word. I think it's really important that we show our solidarity against the Zionist aggression. So we'll meet at 4:30 on Thursday at Wilhelm-Leuschner-Platz. Yes, I'll remind you again later. So now we can start. So I don't know if I need to introduce Vijay because probably most of you know him, but he is a journalist and author from India originally, and he's the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he wrote various books on US imperialism and socialism, and I think the latest was on Cuba. Sadly, we don't have the books here, but you can find them online, and they're definitely worth a look. And yes, today we want to talk about NATO, why NATO is the most dangerous organization of the world. And with this, I want to give the word to Vijay. Welcome.
Hi. Hello. Okay. Listen, I'm sorry that I'm speaking in English, but I tried many years ago to learn the language of Marx, and then I realized that it's just a little too difficult for me. And you should be really happy you grew up as little children learning the language of Hegel and Marx. It's a huge advantage. Although it may be difficult even if you know German to really get Hegel. Marx, clear as daylight. Especially the footnotes in Capital Volume 1, where Marx just goes after people he dislikes or writes with great tenderness and feeling about the factory inspectors, who went out there and built for him the material basis for his own work. Because if the factory inspectors hadn't gone and produced those enormous reports, Marx may not have known exactly what was happening in the factory. When he went with Engels to the factories in Manchester, he was quite shocked. He hadn't had that experience of the gargantuan factory. It hadn't come to Germany yet, or France, or Belgium. It was the first time that he had seen them. Well, today, Atul and I had a great opportunity. We went with Philip and Nicholas from the KO to Buchenwald. And it was really moving. And I must say, it's the first concentration camp I've ever visited. And I don't think I can go to one where the killing was greater. I don't think my constitution can manage Auschwitz. It was really difficult. Partly because it is so beautiful. There are beautiful trees. The view of Weimar from the camp is outstanding. Because many of the buildings have been removed, you don't really get the entire sensibility of the camp. You don't get the sensibility. But the stories, the Soviet soldiers, farm boys really, these were not communist militants. These were farmers' sons who were recruited into the Red Army, who joined the Red Army. 8,443 told to stand against the wall so that their height can be measured, and then shot in the neck from behind from a hole. The shot in the neck thing, 8,463 or something Red Army soldiers shot in a little former stable. And I kept thinking about the German soldiers, the SS people standing there who were told to do that. What a toll it must have taken on them, to just stand there, reload, keep shooting, clean the blood so that the next Red Army soldier doesn't know that they're going to their death. They think they are getting their height measured. It seemed to me a little bit like, the way we kill cattle. They're in a line and they just get shot one by one as they enter the slaughterhouse. There was an ugliness about it. But I must say, I was very moved to hear the stories of resistance. And I was extremely moved to go to the place behind the crematorium where Ernst Thälmann was murdered at night because they, on direct orders from Hitler, to kill him on that night, on the 18th of August, 1944. And Thälmann was brought there. He was shot in darkness so that nobody in the camp knew he was being killed, except there was a Polish prisoner apparently who saw it and then told everybody. And the next day, the communist leadership in the camp met, in the washroom, and they held a commemoration of Thälmann's life. It's extremely moving. And I don't know, I could just spend the whole time talking about my reflections on this. I was very moved. I was also deeply moved and upset that the memorial has been completely neglected. The stone is dirty, the writing is vanishing, the paving area is overgrown with weeds. And, we were talking about how the state doesn't put money into this. But I was thinking if I lived in this country, I would assemble a volunteer group and I would go maybe on August 18th on Thälmann's death anniversary and do a volunteer cleanup of this area against the wishes of the German state, and just do it. If they're not going to do it, we should do it, because this is our monument. And as long as they're not going to bring it down, which they might, we should keep it clean. If they are not going to fly the flags of the nations, maybe we should put the flags up. Just do it ourselves and see what they say as a challenge. I was very moved that it looked like a Roman ruin to me, like a city on the edge of the Mediterranean in decay. And that should not be the case. We should be taking care of that monument. So it's my plea to you, people on the left, to adopt Buchenwald and go there against the wishes of the state on a certain day and clean it up. Maybe, who knows. Many years ago, Noam Chomsky gave an interview where he said something that really, I was so puzzled by what he said that I had to phone him and ask him if he had been misquoted. He said that the United States is the largest terrorist in the whole world. And I thought, normally this guy doesn't exaggerate. He's a scientist. He's extremely precise with his words. So I called him up and asked him a few things, and we were chatting, and I said, Noam, you gave an interview where you were quoted as having said that the United States is the most dangerous terrorist on the planet. Is that were you exaggerating? And in the typical way of Noam Chomsky, he said, no, that's a factual statement. He said, it is the greatest terrorist on earth because it terrorizes the maximum number of people. And at the time, I think we were 5-10 years after the war on Iraq. And he said, look what they did to Iraq. That is an act of terror. It was a war of aggression. It was an illegal war. By then, 750,000 people had died one way or the other. Excess deaths in Iraq. Can't compare those numbers to any other attack, in any part of the world at the time. Yeah? Can't compare those numbers. And then if you start adding up, what the US had done from, say, the first coup against Iran in 1953, Guatemala 1954, you just start agglomerating, adding up the numbers like an accountant. I don't know how many millions we'll reach. And in some small countries like Guatemala, even 2, 3, 4,000 people killed in the highlands of Guatemala, terrorized the entire indigenous population of that country, where the United States effectively provided logistical help and equipment, including weapons, to the Guatemalan death squads to go into these villages and just massacre large number of people, 100 there, 200 there, mass graves. I visited some of these places in Guatemala, small towns, 50 people in a mass grave, just gone. Yeah, 50 people who had been trying to organize the community to fight against big landed interests. They just came into the town and just wiped out everybody, all the people who were organizers. Imagine a force enters this city and they just pick up not just trade unionists, but social workers, anybody who's trying to do good, and just take care of them. Done. Mass graves somewhere. He said, it's not an exaggeration. It's real. That's what it is. Interestingly, when Mark Rutte went to Washington recently, he was sitting with Trump, and Rutte said to Trump, Rutte is just a pathetic politician. Really, it's quite stunning, and I've been saying this a lot recently, how unimpressive European politicians have become. They are singularly unimpressive people. I can't think of one European politician now in whose presence I would feel some sort of, aura. Like, wow, that's a significant person. Macron walking down the streets of Oran in Algeria is spit upon by Algerian people on the street. Those videos are all over YouTube. When he was in Algiers, people jeering at him. Nobody's afraid of him. He's pathetic. Yeah, Keir Starmer. These people are pathetic. In Germany, the great Germany, you used to have lions as chancellors. You've got these pathetic, really, they are suits with no bodies inside, let alone brains. They are pathetic. They're really pathetic. They're so useless. Mark Rutte is so pathetic. He was like the caretaker prime minister in the Netherlands for decades. Every time they couldn't get a government going, they brought him in. Yeah? And now he's just tossed into NATO as the Secretary General. Pathetic guy. Sitting there with Trump, adoringly looking at Trump. Yeah? What is this whole talk about European independence from the Americans? Nothing. Not a jot of independence. Slavish adherence to the Yankee. You don't have one little sliver of light between Europe and the United States elite. Not one. You might dislike Trump, but your leaders are all terrified of him. You might personally think Trump is an idiot, he's dangerous, but your leaders go to Washington and they sit at his feet and they massage them. That's exactly what they do. Mark Rutte, sitting next to Trump, says to Trump, I'm so looking forward to you coming to The Hague. The Hague is my hometown. Please come to The Hague. And then he says to Trump, this is for the NATO summit, he says to Trump, we're going to make the NATO summit a great demonstration of American power. I heard that and I thought, I don't even know why we wrote this dossier. We should have just published that one line. NATO, it's a great alliance, right? Of all these countries, independent European countries plus Canada, plus the United States, all sitting around a table discussing equally about security, yeah? All with their independence, chancellor, prime minister, blah, 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 the big hallowed titles. Actually, they are all stenographers of the Americans. We want to make the NATO summit a great demonstration of American power. Nothing to do with Germany or the Netherlands or France or Britain. It's about American power. We are in complete agreement with American power, Rutt says. We agree with you. We'll do whatever you say, sir. Shall I rub your ankles harder? Or would you like me to move on to your calves? That's the attitude of the great European leadership. Slavish adherence to the US project. What can we do for you, sir? You want us to back the Israelis more? We'll do whatever you say. You want us to back the Israelis against an illegal attack on Iran? We'll do it. Russia invades Ukraine. My God, it's a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Ursula von der Leyen out there flying in the skies, attacking Putin. Get that guy, violent war criminal. Israel attacks Iran. Violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. No UN Security Council resolution allowing the attack. No provocation from Iran. Iran has not attacked Israel. Boom! Silence from the European leadership. No Ursula von der Leyen saying this or that. No Chancellor of Germany saying this or silence. Absolute adherence to US power. Absolute adherence. I don't see a jot of difference. Yeah, 5% of your GDP should be spent on the military. Yes, we'll do it. Whatever it takes. We don't need to feed our children who are poor. We're going to increase we must increase childhood poverty because we need to protect hungry children from the monsters in the world. More important to have more tanks so that the starving children are not going to get killed by somebody else. What the hell is this? How is it even logical? And the populations are completely happy with this. Yes, starve my children, but make sure the Russians don't invade my country. Have you lost your minds? Complete loss of reason. Yeah? The AFD is the greatest danger to Germany. No. The greatest danger to Germany is not the AFD. The greatest danger to Germany is your inability to see that you have national interests. That your kids are going to be starving because you're following the dictate from Washington. What Washington wants now is Europe pay more into NATO and still follow Washington's dictate. And what is NATO to do? That's the interesting thing. What makes NATO the most dangerous organization in the world? What has NATO done? The record of NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union and the destruction of the communist state system in Eastern Europe is absolutely clear. I don't know what your feelings are about Yugoslavia. I have strong feelings. NATO dismembered a country, it was unnecessary. Now you have God knows what. You have a country called North Macedonia. There is no South Macedonia. That country used to be part of the great noble country of Yugoslavia. You had a civil war there, which was largely, and I quite agree with a lot of observers who watch this, largely egged on by the West. Largely egged on, including supported militarily. The destruction of Yugoslavia. Then the destruction in Afghanistan. NATO enters that conflict. To what end? What did your troops do in Afghanistan? I reported from Afghanistan. I watched Western forces in Afghanistan completely clueless. Afghan warlords would go up to the NATO fellows, suck up to them, and tell them there's Taliban over there. That was their historical enemy, that they got NATO fighters to come and bomb. And the NATO people were completely bloody clueless. They couldn't tell one Afghan from the other. Even I, as a reporter, could have said, that's a Taliban, they would have shot him. They were completely clueless, killing people like it's a video game. The Afghan people hate the West. The return of the Taliban, however bad, is not the first time the Afghans have gone in this direction. When the Taliban first came to Afghanistan 94 to 96, they were welcomed because the Mujahideen was so absolutely appalling. And then the people that the West imposed on Afghanistan, just horrible. Destruction of Libya, no accountability. After the bombing of Libya, I joined a bunch of journalists to write to NATO headquarters, asking them, can you give us your targeting information so that we can go in Libya and look and see where you bombed? Peter Olson, the lead lawyer of NATO, wrote us a letter, legal letter back, saying the following: NATO never commits war crimes. NATO is simply not capable as a Western organization of committing war crimes. Effectively, he said, war crimes are committed by savages. Savages. You know who's the savage? The Slavs, the Muslims. They commit war crimes. Europeans, by ontology, are not capable of committing war crimes. It's an ontological claim made by a stupid lawyer from NATO, Peter Olson. The West right now, NATO plus countries, responsible for almost 80% of global military spending. NATO plus countries responsible for 80% of global military spending year on year. China 10%. Sorry, China 4%. Russia 10% in the middle of a war. NATO countries are a military alliance with an overwhelming military force superiority over other countries in the world. And yet, the German media says that it's Russia and China that are threats to the world. The threat to you is coming from China. 4% of world military spending. China is a totally defensive power. It's not interested in invading Germany. It's already invading you with its commodities. Then you block the commodities, saying we don't want you to sell us phones. We'd prefer to buy phones 10 times as expensive. You don't want Russian gas. I understand that. You prefer to buy gas way more expensive and worse for the environment. You have the worst Green Party in the history of Green parties. Your Green Party has nothing to do with the environment. I believe, for instance, your Green Party will get to the point where they want to burn the Black Forest to give you energy. They don't care about the environment anymore. And they have made a mockery of feminism. Their so-called feminist foreign policy is a joke. What do they want? They want Iranian women dead, but without head covering. They would like them to lie in bloody morgues with their heads uncovered. Then they say it's feminism. We've removed the head covering. But they're all dead. You don't care about women as such. You have some fantasy idea of imposing your ideas on the whole world. It's imperialist, not feminist. I thought feminism was about listening to people and choice and so on. They don't care about that. They want to impose their view on the world. It's the worst Green Party ever. So disappointing. The Green Party. Such a strange name also, Green Party. So, peculiar name. I visited the Red Party in Norway. That was also interesting. Blue Party, Red Party, Green Party. Colorful parties. We don't need colorful parties. We need parties with principles. And the one principle we need is stop imposing your will on the world. We did a dossier called the Bandung Spirit. We didn't bring any, but I'd like you to take a look at it. The rest of the world is really focused on the concept of sovereignty. And I'm going to end with this. In Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, you have these military coups. They are super popular military coups. You know, I argue with people who've never been to Africa who say, oh, this is a military coup. I say, listen, I've been to Mali, been to Burkina Faso, been to Niger, seen what the scene is. There is no bourgeoisie in these countries. There is no civil society. The French never allowed any of this to develop, okay? There are lots of progressive organizations in these countries who oppose the military coups, but there's also a lot that support them. And in these countries, the key word is sovereignty. In our dossier, we highlight that word, sovereignty. Don't want the West to tell us what to do with, you know, our resources, the way we want to live our life. We just don't want that. The other key concept is dignity. We've got to fight around the world to insist that the basic dignity of people is upheld. We don't want starvation and hunger. We don't want children to be illiterate. We don't want the IMF to come in and tell us cut your budgets for education, for health, for, you know, social welfare and so on. We don't want that. We want to emancipate ourselves from the dilemmas of humanity. That's what people want. NATO is the exact opposite of the agenda of the Global South. It is the exact opposite. The right-wing Indian Foreign Minister, S. Jaishankar, was asked, why doesn't India join NATO plus? Far right-wing Foreign Minister was asked, why doesn't India join NATO plus? And he said something with which I agree. I don't generally agree with him, but I agreed with this. They said, why don't you join NATO plus? That kind of offensive way that, like a CNN reporter said, why don't you join? This is the way they talk. Why don't you join NATO plus? Well, what kind of reporting is that? You know, you're not reporting, you're aggressively putting forward the viewpoint of the West. You're not asking what is your opinion of something or whatever. Why don't you do this? Yeah? You should do this. You must do this. Can't believe you're doing that. You know, that's not reporting. I've been a journalist for over 30 years. I know I don't go up to people and say, you know, what's wrong with you? Why are you inferior? You know, this is not journalism. You know, it's like a barking dog. Sorry, no offense to your dog over there. Yeah, your dog is very sweet. So the journalist said, why don't you join NATO plus? And Jaishankar said, we don't believe in the NATO mindset. He said, we don't believe in the NATO mindset. I don't believe in it either. I know most of you don't believe in it either. The question is, what are we going to do about that? What is the left in Europe going to do about that? Is the left going to continue to be paralyzed in a debate about, oh, there are so many imperialisms, what do we do about that? Is the left going to be paralyzed about, oh, well, you know, Israel, it's complicated? When are you going to develop a clarity and stand with the struggling people in the South who are demanding you follow a concept that we tend to agree with? We want you to join us to build a shared humanity. We want a shared future for humanity. We want you to join us in that. We don't want to continue being at the bottom of a neo-colonial structure. A shared future for humanity. Let's go.
Thank you very much, Vijay. You already talked a bit about the question of the tasks of the left and also on who is imperialist and who not, but I want to dig a bit deeper into that question because you were mainly referring to the Green Party now, but actually the discussion on who is imperialist and who is our main enemy, it goes far beyond the Green Party. And I mean, with the example of the war on Iran now, we see, I saw some critical faces here as well, and I think it's not not clear for the left and communists in Germany that the aggressor here is clearly the Zionist that we have been fighting in the last years, and that we actually developed a stance that they are the ones who bring chaos to the region. But now suddenly it's not clear that they are the ones who are the aggressors and the US, but somehow people tend to think that Iran is also an imperialist power. And in your brochure on NATO, but also in the brochure on hyper-imperialism that Tricontinental Institute published, you made it really clear that NATO is the main enemy that poses a threat to the people of the world, and that everyone who doesn't subordinate themselves to it will be a target. And we have a lot of smaller countries who try to get independent. You mentioned the very important example of the Sahel states. But yes, then we also have those bigger countries, Russia, China, Iran. And so people are insecure about how to deal with those countries here. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on what our stance as anti-imperialists should be.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's 3 countries, Russia, China, Iran. Let's stay with Russia for a minute, yeah? Because that's captivating large parts of Europe. Certainly Russia invaded Ukraine. That goes without saying. That technically is a violation of the UN Charter. Lots of countries invade other countries. India invaded Pakistan in 1971. And then Bangladesh was formed. And the question can be raised, was India imperialist? When Vietnam invaded Cambodia to stop the killing fields, was Vietnam imperialist? I mean, it's trivial in a way to think of an invasion of one neighbor of another as imperialism. I mean, I don't know, that takes us, forget Lenin. Forget Lenin's 1916 text on imperialism. That's even pre-Hobson, the liberal British writer, who Lenin borrowed a lot from in his text on imperialism. Even Hobson would laugh at that assessment, that just because a country invades another country makes it imperialist. That's not imperialism. That's an invasion. That's a military conflict. That's a war. That's not imperialism. Imperialism is a much deeper concept. It refers to the attempt by a state or a group of states to subordinate the world for their pecuniary benefit, whether it's commercial, getting markets, getting resources, or political. You don't want countries to exercise their sovereignty. It's a much deeper concept than just a war. And so the question can be asked, does Russia want to take over Europe? Are we going to see Russian tanks in Berlin and in Paris and in Lisbon? No. They're not even moving to Kiev. Look, frankly, like I said, I've covered a lot of conflicts. When Vladimir Zelensky leaves Ukraine, he flies out of Kiev airport. The Russians haven't even dismantled Kiev airport. When the Americans hit Iraq, they smashed all the infrastructure, destroyed all the ability of the Iraqis to move, all transport systems, almost all bridges, power grids, everything was taken out in shock and awe. The Russians can do that. They have shown at specific points that they can hit water plants, they can hit electricity grids, and so on. They haven't taken out Kiev airport. Why? Why not? Are they incapable? No, they just don't care. They have a limited war aim. Keep Crimea. Build a land bridge to Crimea because they don't want the water and electricity cut off, like the Ukrainians did after 2014. They had to build a bridge to the Russian mainland. They want to take the Donbass region, Russian-speaking region. They have a limited war aim. That doesn't make them imperialist. They are not interested in Berlin. They've been here before. The last time they came here, it was to save you from yourself. And then they pretty much left. Okay, they pretty much left. The DDR was not a Soviet outpost. They left. They came here, they left. They saved you, they left. They are not interested in coming back. They are not interested. And by the way, all studies show that the German army cannot withstand a war against the Russian army. All the studies done that I've seen from German think tanks show that. Matter of a couple of weeks. That's why you're so frantically trying to rebuild as if the Russians are interested in a war. The Chinese are not interested in occupying the world. And to take Taiwan as an example of Chinese aggression is crazy. Because both Taiwan and the Chinese mainland see each other as one space. Don't forget that when Chiang Kai-shek's army goes and occupies Taiwan and creates a military dictatorship that lasts for decades, it's not democracy, for decades, the government in Taiwan claimed to be the government of all of China. Until they had the UN seat, they claimed. Even now, they claim to be the center of all of China. They are both contesting who is the center. They are not contesting we are separate. Now, there are people in Taiwan who say we are a separate country. That's different. But they have a contested view of sovereignty. Chinese are not interested in invading Philippines. They have no interest. They don't have the kind of foreign military footprint that the United States has. The United States has 900. We counted them, 900 foreign military bases. 900. Many of them are in this independent country. This independent country and the other one in Europe, Italy, continue to have the same, almost the same military bases as the Yanks had in the 1940s. It's very interesting. The Soviets withdrew their military mostly from the DDR. But the Yanks continued to have their military bases. That was just okay. You know, we've normalized the US military footprint completely. I mean, I sometimes don't think these are really independent countries. Like when Trump said we're going to seize Greenland, I laughed when I heard that. Because Greenland is substantially already controlled by the United States. Northern Greenland is a massive US military base, puffin base, and it's been there since the 1940s. What annexation of Greenland is necessary? It's already part of the United States. Panama. Trump also said we'll take Panama. Panama is filled with US military bases that have never been dismantled. And US military land, from which they did leave, but continues to be owned by the US military along the Panama Canal. So what annexation is necessary? When the US didn't like the Panamanian leader, 1989, Manuel Noriega, they just sent in special forces, he was a horrible guy, but he used to work for the CIA. They grabbed him and brought him to Florida, threw him in prison. What sovereignty does Panama have? You know, it's kind of ridiculous. It's ridiculous to think about, oh, there are all these competing imperialisms. Man, you got to just look at the evidence. You know, Iran, imperialist, it is completely a defensive power. Everything that the Iranians did in building that so-called first ring of defense, Hezbollah and so on, was to protect Iran, an insurance policy against an Israeli attack on Iran. Israel threatens Iran all the time and then says that Iran is threatening Israel. And therefore, Israel has an existential threat. Israel uses this ideologically all the time. We are under existential threat. They want to conduct a Holocaust again. And because you are still guilty about the Holocaust, the real Holocaust, you're like, let's support Israel. It's completely ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. The debate in Germany around Israel is so juvenile. It's infantile. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's sometimes good to hear that from somebody from the outside because sometimes feel like we are living in another world here in Germany, if you look at the international media. Yeah, thank you for those remarks. Maybe one more question, and then I'll also open for everyone to ask questions. You were talking about China, Russia, Iran being more in a defensive role and not being the ones who aggressively attack, but maybe we can go a bit further. What is their role for other countries who try to, and I mean also those countries, we can't forget that, are trying to fight for keeping their sovereignty. It's not like we can be sure that they'll keep it forever. It's threatened by the imperialists and they openly say so. But what role do they play for other countries? And I mean, sometimes there may be also doubts, like maybe there's some, for example, China is even doing some economic deals with Israel, so could they do more for the oppressed countries, and why aren't they?
Yeah, there's two questions really. Let me stay with the second question. Why don't these countries do more? Yeah? Well, the easy answer is that they are rational, at least as far as I'm concerned, and they know that if they cross certain red lines, they will get hit hard. So, for instance, the Iranians, quite correctly, are terrified, not of Israel, they can defend themselves against Israel, but they're terrified that the United States might use its full power to come in and launch an attack on Iran. I mean, that's exactly what they were afraid of was going to happen when Trump sent the B-2 bombers against Pardos and so on. That is scary for them. You know, the Chinese fear that the US will place hypersonic nuclear missiles in Taiwan, which can reach Beijing in a matter of minutes. They are afraid of that. I mean, these are realities. Because they have seen countries get wiped out. Libya was wiped out. Libya does not exist. There are 3, if not 4 governments in Libya now. Yeah, the oil production has gone to almost under 20%. It's in really bad shape and nobody cares. That was done by NATO and done by crooks like Sarkozy. You know, Sarkozy, remember him? Bloody crook. You know, he was the guy who pushed the attack on Libya. Obama, you know, who sat in his office with a list of names of people and signed on Thursdays. It was the day that the list came to him, and signed his name at the bottom of the list. And then the CIA went off for the rest of the week and drone attack tried to kill all these people. It was called a kill list. I don't know if you, how many of you didn't know about the kill list and the Thursday signatures? Everybody knows about the kill list? Yeah? Obama sat in his office in the White House. The CIA director or his deputy would bring this list and he would ask questions about one of the kill lists that he saw, which he signed off on, was to kill a 16-year-old Yemeni American US citizen who was sitting outside Sana'a in some small town at a cafe, roadside cafe, when a missile struck the 16-year-old boy, Yemeni American. His father was Anwar al-Awlaki, who had been killed previously. They killed the son, 16-year-old, US citizen. Obama signed the thing. This is the same man who signed off on the war against Libya. You know, we have a fantasy of the West as being, you know, just and liberal and all of that. I don't share that fantasy. That died for me a long time ago. I see Obama sitting there and looking at this list of names, seeing al-Awlaki, 16-year-old, 16 years old, US citizen, He's a US citizen. He's entitled to protection under the US Constitution, annulled by the US president. Signed Barack Obama, not Donald Trump. Yeah? So in that sense, when we think about like these countries and what they have done, it's pretty stunning, and our obligation should be deepened by that. I mean, we should be embarrassed by that. What did Angela Merkel say during all those years when the Americans were doing these drone assassinations? And at the time when the US was basically spying on her phone, the Germans just took it. You just took it. You didn't really do anything. I mean, she knew that the US was spying on her phone. Didn't do anything about it. Made public, I think, by Snowden. Yeah? Didn't do anything about it. You just took it. What the hell is that? So when we say, what more can China and so on do, they have also a rational perspective that they are dealing with they are dealing with people who think that they are the adversary. Like my conversations with people from these countries, they make it clear, we don't see Europe or the West as our adversary. We want a shared future for humanity. But they see us as an adversary and they could hurt us. We want development. We don't want a bombing of the new city of Shenyang. We just don't want that. So we are not going to. And secondly, it is true that all countries, South Africa, private company, South Africa, which took Israel to the International Court of Justice, has a company, Eskom, that sells coal to Israel now. When the Colombian government forbade coal exports to Israel, South Africa picked up the exports. South Africa took Israel to the ICJ and is supplying coal. Yeah, we live in a very complicated world. These countries say we cannot ban private commerce. The Chinese say this is a private company. The Chinese government doesn't sell drones to Israel or drone technology. It's a private company. Now, I believe that loophole should be closed. I believe that all of this should stop. That's my belief. Yeah, but that's different. They say, look, we have this problem. Now, again, I don't agree with that as a problem. Solve the problem. Close the loophole. It's a genocide, yeah? But I also am listening to what they are saying. All these countries say the same thing. Private companies, we can't stop them from doing what they want to do. Why not? You do it all the time. If I'm a private company and I say I want to trade in children, you say, no, you can't. It's illegal. You can't do that. There are rules. So you're a private company, want to sell lethal weapons to Israel to kill children? Same thing. Shut it down. I agree with that, but they just don't. So obviously they can do more. I of course agree.
Thank you. Yeah, but we should also appreciate what they are already doing and not lose sight of that. If we also look at our own country, where we still didn't manage to stop the weapon exports to Israel. So I will take questions from the audience now. I think you might have to come up to the front. I'm sorry. Yes, because we don't have another microphone, I think. So maybe if you have questions, you can already come to the front as well. Yes.
No, you can try German. You can tell me.
But I can do both.
But tell your name.
Yeah. Hi, hello, I'm Adrian. I'm going to ask my question in both languages. So my question would be, is NATO a kind of union and organization that in future could still be opted out of, in the sense that it could gradually dissolve itself, or is it kind of is the pact too strong? Is it kind of will it only ever be dissolved through a kind of violent dissolution in some kind of final conflict? Und auf Deutsch, meine Frage wäre, ob die NATO eine Organisation ist, die sich noch Stück für Stück auflösen lässt mit der, sagen wir mal, freiwilligen Austritt der Mitglieder oder der Partnerstaaten, oder ob es nur möglich ist, dass diese Organisation sich durch Gewalt im Verlauf eines Konflikts auflöst. Thank you very much.
Great. That was great. Yeah. Let's take a couple. I always prefer that.
Okay, ich würde meine Frage nur auf Deutsch stellen, beziehungsweise eher ein bisschen Beitrag. Achso, ja, ich bin Franzi. Freut mich, dass du da bist. Vielen, vielen Dank für den spannenden Vortrag. Ich denke, der hat sehr viele gute Punkte gesetzt. Ich wollte zu einer Sache was sagen, wo ich dir, glaube ich, ein bisschen vielleicht widersprechen würde, in Bezug auf wie man eigentlich die europäischen Staaten einschätzen kann, beispielsweise auch Deutschland. Im Bezug, du hast, glaube ich, gesagt, sie sind so, handeln als Sklaven der USA oder sind denen quasi komplett ausgeliefert, wie man an verschiedenen Punkten sieht, wie jetzt beispielsweise die 5%, die durchgesetzt werden wollen, die Militarisierung, der Kriegskurs etc. Ich denke, auf der einen Seite ist es natürlich richtig zu sagen, diese Staaten sind sehr abhängig von den USA. Deutschland ist auch sehr abhängig gemacht worden, gerade nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg. Trotzdem muss man auch sagen, die Militarisierung Deutschlands lief vor allem über die NATO. Das war die Möglichkeit Deutschlands, der BRD, wieder sich aufzurüsten nach dem verlorenen Zweiten Weltkrieg. Und das, was jetzt gerade eigentlich realisiert wird und umgesetzt wird, ist meiner Meinung nach das, worauf auch die Herrschenden hier in unserem Land, der deutsche Imperialismus, sehr lange hingearbeitet hat. Und insofern ist es schon auch wichtig, dieses Eigeninteresse zu erkennen und auch zu benennen, weil das, glaube ich, auch gerade hier vor Ort manchmal in die Irre führt, wenn man das total quasi negiert und sagt, das einzige Problem sind eigentlich die USA und dass unsere Regierenden denen quasi so ausgeliefert sind. Ich denke, es liegt sehr, sehr klar im Interesse Deutschlands. Es gab sehr klar Pläne aus deutschen Thinktanks auf die 5% zu kommen. Das wurde lange vorbereitet und Trump wird eher vorgeschoben, dass man sagt, okay, Trump fordert 5%, das ist ja total irre, ja, zu was zwingt er uns eigentlich? Aber letztendlich lag das auch schon lange in den deutschen Schubladen. Ich denke, der Hintergrund ist ganz klar, dass Deutschland wieder eine Militärmacht werden will und das über Europa und über die NATO probiert, aber natürlich auf jeden Fall den USA unterlegen ist, das will ich hier nicht in Abrede stellen, das auf jeden Fall, die USA sind der stärkste Player, aber nur in Bezug auf, sie sind Sklaven oder so, das war mir zu stark.
No, it's okay. I'll try to translate. So basically her question was about the role, or maybe it was more a comment than a question. It was a comment on the role of German imperialism on EU as well, but especially Germany. And she had some disagreement with your point that Germany is a slave of the US. Of course, there's a big independence, and she would agree that Germany is not as powerful as the US, but Germany also kind of took advantage of using NATO to remilitarize and to rearm, and that it was also a plan that was talked about in think tanks and so on, and that her theory was kind of that Trump is kind of a scapegoat now to say, oh, now because he's so bad, we have to rearm ourselves to be safe. But actually, this is also a goal, and there's the goal of the German ruling class to be more independent military power by itself. But the way to come to this point or to get to this point is NATO and the US. So maybe we take one more question, yeah?
Thank you. My name is Boas. My question, okay. My question goes in a very similar direction. I agree with Franci's comment a lot. I would be interested to hear more about sort of the inter-imperialist conflicts within NATO, and especially also the recent developments with the E3 group and sort of a movement of independence within NATO, but still under this sort of Western imperialism drive, and especially also Trump's sort of shift, at least in rhetoric, towards being less supportive of NATO, which sort of seems counterintuitive, as you said. NATO is an organization for US dominance, but he seems to weaken the trust in that organization for its allies. And I would be interested in sort of an analytical take about the inter-imperialist conflicts.
First, Adrian's question is really interesting. How do you end, or how does one exit NATO and NATO? And I want to link that to the other two questions, which are about, let's call it, European independence. Yeah? Inter-imperialism doesn't exist, actually. I don't feel like we are in a period where inter-imperialist conflict or crisis is taking place. And this actually relates to all the questions in a way. You know, let me go back a little bit, talk about Lenin's text from 1916. See, Lenin was facing a challenge, theoretically, in 1915 and 16. He was trying to understand, how is it possible that these European powers and then the United States enter into a war against each other? He was trying to find a theory of the war. Very interesting, the previous year in 1915, the US Marxist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a text in the Atlantic magazine, very short text, called The African Roots of the War. So it's a brilliant text. If you read Du Bois's 1915 text and then Lenin 1916, you see the amazing overlaps that these creative Marxists are able to come up with really fascinating ways of looking at the world. Du Bois argued in 1915 that in fact the conflict in Europe was a conflict over colonies, and a conflict over colonies largely in Africa. Maybe he overstated the case in his text, but he had a really good point. What Lenin argued from a much more materialist standpoint, using Hobson's work, to some extent Hilferding and others, Lenin argued that firms under the condition of competitive capitalism inside a territory, because most of them operated inside a territory. So even, let's say, British firms operated inside a territory. It wasn't Britain, it was the imperial preference system. So it included India, Canada, and so on, where these British firms got preferences. But these firms had grown out of their territory and were seeking markets outside their territory, so that British firms were seeking markets in Europe and so on. And that as firms began to seek markets and expansion, monopoly powers in other people's territory, firms in other countries went running to their states and said, protect us. And that was the origin of an inter-capitalist crisis that was transmuted into an inter-imperialist conflict. That's Lenin's argument. Lenin developed that argument to explain why the Great War happened. In fact, I've often said that Lenin's text is not a general theory of imperialism. What he was writing about in 1915-16 doesn't apply after the Russian Revolution. In fact, the Russian Revolution immediately changes the whole world situation. And Lenin never had time in that period after 1917 to his death in 24 to revise and create a more generalized theory of imperialism for the next phase. Because in the next phase, the countries that had gone to war against each other allied to invade the Soviet Union, or first the Soviet Republic. They all did it together. The Germans, the this, that, they all did it. And eventually, after the long, what people are calling the long civil war from 1914 to 1945, eventually a bloc develops where it is quite clear to the advanced capitalist countries that they cannot afford to have too great a conflict amongst each other or between each other, but have to focus their attention on the tidal, the tidal power of the Bolshevik menace, which was the term used after 1917. This attempted unity of the Atlantic powers, at least, is what led to the creation of NATO in 1949. NATO was a military alliance of the major capitalist countries that turned the inter-capitalist rivalries between these countries to mute. In NATO, they basically muted their internal conflicts. And that muting was further muted when they created the G7 in 1974. I wrote a book called The Poorer Nations, where I studied very closely the documents from the formation of the G7. And like the German Chancellor, I think it's Helmut Schmidt, 74, I think it was Schmidt. Schmidt was from the SPD, right? Yeah, it was Helmut Schmidt. Schmidt goes to Rambouillet, the founding meeting of the G7. I quote the whole thing in the Poorer Nations. And he says to the leaders of the other countries, the 6 other countries, Canada, Italy, Britain, France, Japan, who am I leaving out? One more. Italy, thanks a lot. Italy, how could I leave out Italy? Okay, he tells the other heads of government, look, I'm friends with the leader of the textile workers movement in Germany. I'm friends. They helped me get elected, he says. But the textile industry in Germany is finished. Even though it's profitable, he says, we are going to let it go. He tells, it's like a collusion. They are colluding behind the backs of the working class of their own countries in the G7. It's incredible to read the statements they make to each other. They say that the Italian textile industry is also not very productive, but it will stay because it's for luxury goods. And so it will be protected. We will allow protection. I mean, they are deciding the fate of workers in Europe, sitting in the castle of Rambouillet in 1974. And Helmut Schmidt comes from the SPD, not from the right. He's colluding with the other leaders. So the inter-imperialist conflict goes to mute, virtually silent. You know, there are moments, for instance, where you see countries in the G7 try to push their weight and the US just tamps it down. The historic example of this is Japan. Japan's industry begins to grow very fast. United States doesn't like it. They call the Japanese to the Plaza Hotel in New York. And they signed the first Plaza Accord in 1985, where Japan had to revise its currency in order to make Japanese imports into the US more expensive. And then 10 years later, in the reverse Plaza Accord, they just changed the currency at will. The US just tells them to do it. That's exactly what the US was telling the Chinese to do for the last 20 years. Revise your currency so your imports are more expensive to the end. The Chinese refused. But the Japanese agreed. At the cost of the Japanese workers and middle class, because they went through a long period of no growth in Japan. Japan is saved by the fact that their debt is internal. The Japanese people continue to pay for their own debt. They don't have to import debt. That's what saves Japan. Otherwise, it would be in an incurable debt crisis. It is in a debt crisis, but it's internal debt. So when we think about these countries' independence, let's look at the material realities. Let's not just listen to some statements here and there, because those are also out of national desire to say that they are independent to their people. But they are not independent countries. Germany's independence is compromised by a number of factors. I'll lay them out. One of them is you don't have sovereign control over your land. You have foreign military bases. You know, the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have said all foreign military bases go. French go, Americans, and they are going to have to go. There is no movement in Germany that says foreign military should leave. There is no movement that I know of. Small. Okay, it's small, but that's not a movement. That's a group. That's not a movement. You don't have mass rallies outside Rambouillet saying, sorry for my French, fuck off. You don't have that. You are quite content. They sit on top of you. That's point number one. Point number two, we did a study of this. German bourgeoisie does not invest its surplus in Germany, in the DAX. German bourgeoisie puts its money into New York and London, into BlackRock. That's the best rate of return right now if you have a lot of money. They are not putting their money into the DAX. So the German bourgeoisie is compromised. They don't care if Germany is not doing great. They care that the stock market in Washington isn't losing the value of their money. The important thing for them is that there shouldn't be too much inflation of the dollar. That's all. Sound money so that their dollar assets are intact. They are not holding euros in the DAX. So they are not a German bourgeoisie. They are something else. They are a G7. There is a G7 bourgeoisie. That's how I think of it. There is a section of a G7 bourgeoisie invested in the US stock market or in London. That's the second reason why German independence is compromised. And the third reason is that you have political leaders who are unable to give you an honest account of your being compromised. None of these leaders seem to come to the people and say, these are the reasons we are compromised, and build a movement in their countries for genuine independence from foreign dictation of their policy. I mean, do you think it was a good idea, for instance, to get rid of Nord Stream 2? Was that a good idea for the German people? No, it was a terrible idea. But somebody decided to get rid of Nord Stream 2. I don't know who. Somebody decided. Yeah? The E3. I mean, France, Germany, Italy. Yeah? What is that? What is the agenda? What will they really do? I mean, I can hold meetings. Yeah? The British Prime Minister can call a meeting. Macron, British Prime Minister, Zelensky. We're going to save Ukraine. Really? Do you think Europe without the United States can actually take on the Russians? Impossible. Impossible. You can spend 10% of your GDP on the military, you won't be able to go into that battle against the Russians. In Britain, it's a great example. No British youth under 25 is joining the military unless out of compulsion. In other words, because of money. None of the kids with tons of piercing and tattoos want to go and fight a ridiculous war. They are living a middle-class life. Those days of people wanting to go and defend their country are long over. They are not going to be able to create armies, build enough jet airplanes. The India-Pakistan war demonstrated something really interesting. That once you get to 4.5 generation warfare, both sides are using similar warfare. And by the way, this was also shown between Iran and Israel. As long as the US didn't enter, these countries cannot actually fight wars against each other. The warfare capacity has reached a point, 4.5 generation, 5 generation weapon systems, that really nobody can win a war. Neither India nor Pakistan could take out the other's air defenses. No Indian planes crossed into Pakistani airspace in the 3 nights of fighting. No Pakistani airplanes crossed into Indian airspace. Only drone swarms went across the border. They fired from their own airspace. And the destruction was minimal. Why? Because the ground-to-air defenses systems are super sophisticated now. And they both had pretty much matching systems. Can't fight a war. Same with Israel and Iran. Nobody can prevail. They'll both just fire missiles at each other, it's over. Unless the Yanks come in with a massive air war, they can destroy everything in Iran. Without the Yanks, you can't do anything. Germany fighting Russia, come on guys. The last time that happened, you needed the Yanks, you needed, the Soviets. Come on. It just doesn't work. You needed the Yanks on your side if you were going to, then they decided not to go with you. Churchill decided not to go with you. Yeah, they decided to betray Hitler. And then in the end, after great suffering, tens of millions of Soviet citizens, that war came to an end. Yeah? So I don't see the independence. I really, really don't. I want to see it. But I really, really don't see the material basis of it.
Yeah, we often have those discussions when we're discussing with Marxists outside of Germany, and I think it really is our task as German Marxists to make more clear why we are still convinced that German imperialism is dangerous, to look at the role of EU and so on. I think it would be another discussion, and we might continue it another day, but yes, I think it's mainly our task to work on that. And yes, with the warfare you said, I mean, sadly we saw in Gaza that unbearable, unthinkable things are happening, and it's not only about winning a war, but imperialism brings destruction, and we might see a lot more of that. So yes, it's good to also have the perspective on how to get out of it. So I'll take the next round of questions.
Okay, thank you for taking 3 questions. I'll be brief, but thanks to Adrian, I have now only 3 questions. So the first one, we know that Europe is indefensible, but we also know Europe makes the world dumber. As far as I know, the alphabetism decreased over the rule of the British in India. I don't have the numbers, but you probably know. And we now have the same problem here. I mean, you talked about this already. There is an obvious lack in knowledge from the world, from how the world functions, how people live here. I wonder where does this come from? Have you, as an outsider to this Europe, a perspective on that? The second thing is on the continuation of rule, which I think can be exemplified at Trump, who, if I have that correct, he killed the daughter of Anwar al-Awlaki in the first weeks of his rule. So I wonder if we actually can talk about a difference in rulers over time in our Western NATO countries, or is there more of a, well, somebody says deep state, I don't know how to call this. And the last one is on Iran. Khamenei, Imam Khamenei said, we know the horrors of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, and per fatwa he forbade, called the use of mass destruction weapons forbidden. We saw now the parliament that first tried to have negotiations with the West, to reach the hand to the West, is trying to invent now, or is going away, wants to leave the non-proliferation treaty. And if I understand that correctly, what stands before them leaving is to stop the fatwa. So is there a possibility for, let's call it, reason to prevail? Thank you.
No, let's take it. Because these are similar questions. The doggy question.
Yes. What do you want to say? Okay. Let me try. Do you think there's any hope of a revival movement? Cornelius.
Cornelius?
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you. It's quite too many syllables. Do you think there's any hope for some kind of a revival movement for Eastern Germany, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia, or do you think that those are past graves and there will be a future without those nations? Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
No more questions? Then, did you want to ask? Yes?
Hello, my name is Motashim, and I have one question related to recent conflict.
The doggy did have a comment. Good comment. Yeah.
Okay, I'm thinking that why Russia and China are not going to protect or give us some comfort to Iran, because in the future, if you want to develop a multipolar world, and the multipolar world would say that, hey, why should not I join with the gangsters? At least they give me protections. Okay, hanging out with gangsters is better than some of these kids or who are nice, disciplined kids, but when it comes to conflict with my neighbors or someone, then the gangsters will come to protect me. So how the multipolar world can sustain this type of stability? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are really far away from a multipolar world. Really, really far away. I mean, the proposition that I have been thinking about is that unipolarity is dying, but it's not dead. You know, the United States is having a hard time managing the world in its interest. But it can still destroy a lot of countries. And as I said earlier, the confidence of these states to get directly involved in conflicts is very high. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Chinese immediately released a statement criticizing the invasion. That was what the Chinese said. They said this is a violation of the UN Charter. And then a few months later, they signed the No Limits Partnership with Russia. They are in the middle of a real contradiction. I mean, you can say it's not a contradiction because they believe strongly in the UN Charter. But on the other hand, they are also struggling to find a new foreign policy orientation. The world is changing very fast, but also not fast enough. That's the kind of dialectics of where we are. Certain things are changing really fast. The US is just not able to manage things, and therefore they are complaining that the international rules-based order is collapsing, as they say. They've been saying that since Trump won. The rules-based international order is in threat or in danger, etc., etc. They know that their ability to control things is no longer what it used to be. They know that. But it is not clear yet how the jigsaw puzzle will be organized. So these other countries are still extremely wary of walking into conflict situations. In 2015, Russia sent planes into Syria to prevent the attack on Damascus. But that was to defend the Russian military base in Tartus, in Latakia. That was not really to defend the Assad government. They didn't care about the Assad government. They cared about their base. They knew the Assad government is fragile. And you saw how it just collapsed, right? Without Iranian troops, without more Russian troops, and so on. They went in to defend their base. They didn't go to defend Syria. They knew, for instance, that Iran is not going to collapse with this attack. But they were worried about a US bombing, which then did come. Trump said 2 weeks and then he bombed after 2 days. Yeah, it's a real gangster move. I'm going to give you 2 weeks. And then 2 days later he bombs. Yeah? But the Russians and Chinese are cautious and worried about this. They don't want chaos in Iran. Iran is really important to China's Belt and Road. They don't want this to implode. But what does one expect them to do? They are providing arms to Iran. That is very clear. Iran is providing drones to Russia for Ukraine. They are all working together. There's lots of arms shipments going to Iran. But the Iranians are not going to see Chinese troops there. You're just not going to see that in the world to come. We are not going to see Chinese bases in Syria and so on. They are not interested. They want to build bridges and roads and say, you defend yourself. They really take this idea of sovereignty seriously. The Chinese don't have a foreign military base. They have a naval station in Djibouti to support the UN resolution against piracy. I totally oppose that base on the grounds that the UN resolution against piracy is super badly phrased. And they mostly go after these Somali ex-fishermen whose fishing routes have been ruined. Rather than deal with that, they are now criminalizing these fellows. Okay, they disrupt the shipping in the area, but for God's sake, let's have a balanced UN resolution, blah, 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 blah. You can go on forever on that. But the Chinese don't have a foreign military. They are not interested. They want to help the Iranians have a strong defensive capacity. So what this Iran war is going to do, Alex, you didn't say your name, but I happen to know it. What this Iran attack is doing is Iran is going to have a nuclear bomb. I think the Iranians would be stupid not to build a nuclear bomb. They would be stupid not to do that. And I'm not saying that out of joy. I think there should be no nuclear bombs anywhere in the world. I think everybody, but the Iranians would be stupid not to build one immediately. The Israelis have nuclear weapons, and the Iranians know, because they are not stupid, that when Libya decided to give up its nuclear weapons capacity, it was destroyed. North Korea has a nuclear weapons capacity, nobody dares attack it. That's just one and one. Oh, and that one is more, because now it's 0 and 1. That's just like so straightforward logic. Yeah? And here's what I really fear. This Israeli-US attack on Iran is going to have Myanmar get a bomb. Myanmar within a year is going to declare that it has a nuclear bomb. Yeah? It's not just Myanmar. Maybe Saudi Arabia. Maybe Turkey. These countries are all going to go nuclear. Why? Because of this attack on Iran. So, in the name of non-proliferation, we're going to see a lot more nuclear countries in the next year and a half, maybe 2 years. I guarantee you, that's going to happen. What happened in the Iranian parliament was absolutely logical. They had to take a step because, look, Iran was an early 1958 signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran has a declared nuclear energy program. Iran allowed all its sites to be inspected. Iran continued to come to the table for illegal negotiations around its nuclear energy program. The negotiations forced on Iran by the European Union, US and the UN were illegal because they were debating something that should have been happening at the IAEA alone. Yeah, but they agreed to it. The so-called four-party talks or whatever it was called. Israel has a nuclear bomb. Many of them. Is not a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Is not a member strictly of the IAEA. Has no inspections. Has never been brought to an illegal talks process. India is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Does not really participate in the IAEA. It's on the board occasionally. But doesn't really. There are no real inspections. Got a waiver from the United States to get nuclear material from the nuclear suppliers group. Got a waiver. Illegal nuclear weapons program. Twice tested nuclear weapons. Has never been to illegal talks to get them to roll back the nuclear weapons program. Why should Iran stay in the IAEA? It's crazy. Get out of the NPT. Tell the IAEA inspectors to leave. Test your bomb. Done. That's what they're going to do. It's the only logical thing. I'm sorry for that. I don't agree with it. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not one of those people like, yeah, the resistance, get a bomb, drop it on. I'm not that person. I don't say this out of joy. This is what's going to happen. And Myanmar is going to do this. If I was in the military leadership in Myanmar, I would go straight nuclear. Call the North Koreans, tell them to ship me a bomb through Thailand or something. Big container that says, you know, whatever, turbines. And it's 2 missiles and 3 or 4 bombs. And then they test one of the small ones and then say, goodbye everybody, we have gone nuclear. You can't overthrow us now. Yeah, that's what they're going to do. Finally, and I mean, I don't want to go into the knowledge of, or maybe I'll go into the knowledge of the world for a second in a bit. Look, we all are nostalgic, my friend. We are all nostalgic, yeah? I mean, today I went and saw where Talman was dead. I saw that. I felt terrible, you know? I really felt terrible. Like, there was another possibility. I asked the 2 comrades, Philippe and Nicholas, what are those people? Have you all seen the statue that looks out at the field? Yeah, that amazing statue on top of the stairs. I asked them, can you give me in one sentence, what are these people saying now to the people of Germany? All these people in the line. And one of them said, what did you do in the 1990s? What did you do? Philippe said, what did you do? Yeah? And Nicholas said, the statues are saying, what can we do to change the shit that's out there in Germany today? They're pretty good sentences, yeah? What did you do and what should we do? We are all a little nostalgic, but nostalgia doesn't help us at all. Really, it's Nicholas's question that's the real question. What are we going to do? What do we owe the sacrifices that, you know, took place at Buchenwald by the people who died there? What, you know, 1.1 million in Auschwitz, what do we owe them? We owe them a lot. Those millions of Soviet troops that smashed fascism, what do we owe them? What are we going to do with our lives? That's what I think about every day. I mean, I have all those nostalgia things, the photographs, the, you know, Tito thing, and my office is filled with all that crap, okay? I've got like 2 Lenin busts and Mao and Ho Chi Minh and all of that stuff, yeah? Fidel, I have a signed thing from Fidel, okay? It was amazing, yeah. Fidel was my hero. I spoke with him 3 or 4 times. It was amazing. I was super in love with him. He was like this giant of a human being, yeah? Really amazing guy, like honest and decent and big, you know? Like, I don't mean physically, just physically, but he had an aura, yeah? Not like these people you have now, you know, they just bodies, as I said, suits without a body, or bodies without a shadow, you know? They don't have a shadow. They just don't have any meat to their thoughts coming to you. Habermas signing a letter in favor of the Israeli genocide. I mean, is that where the Frankfurt School dies? You know, is that where the Frankfurt School dies with that letter? Is that why now I say all my Frankfurt School books leave my section of my library on Marxism and get relegated to junk? Everything, you know, everything. Going back to critical theory, Horkheimer, everything disappears from my Marxism shelves. I never had a book from Habermas, couldn't understand a word that he was writing. But this letter that he signed, it's the end of the Frankfurt School. And is it then also the end of great German philosophy? Is this the journey from Hegel to Habermas? And then it ends. You know, Hegel had ideas. Hegel had a vision. Marx saw that. Marx took Hegel and made something of the method, took the method to history, to sociology, to reality, brought back for us a vision of the world, a real vision of the real world, with emancipation at its heart. Marx brought that for us. The great highest point of German philosophy, in my opinion. The highest point. And then the incredible interpreters of Marx and the people who took Marx further, including Lenin, Ho Chi Minh's writing on emulation, taking the ideas embedded in Marx's, let's call it humanism, whatever it is. Incredible development of our tradition. But what is this? What has Germany produced in thought in the last period? Walk into a bookshop, it's an embarrassment. You know, what are the great thinkers thinking? Doing petty work. You know, the history of Germany from 1928 to 1929. The philosophers writing about junk, self-help books, not philosophy. You know, I can't name, I've asked professors, give me a list of the great German thinkers that are alive today. All of them say, you know, it's not possible. Who are they? You know, who's the great Marxist thinker today in Germany? Who? They are merely Marxians, interpreters of Marx. Tell me about them later, okay? Give me the list. I'm asking for the list. I don't know these people. Who I see are people who are basically Marxologists. They interpret Marx for Marxists. What did Marx say in the Grundrisse? That's not a Marxist, that's a Marxologist. Marxist has to look at the actual movement of history and use the method, even sometimes improve the method, to give us an account of what is going on outside the window. That's a Marxist. Marxist has to be alive, looking to see where is the tempo of the working class, not what did Marx say. We are not a religious order that sits and interprets the Bible over and over again. Marx is not a god. Marx is a guide. Yeah? So I don't get it, Alex. I don't see in Europe the great mass of thinkers, you know, who are even critics of the limits of the right. I see people scaring you about the far right, who are scary. But that's not helping you emancipate your societies. We are seeking emancipation. They are seeking a U-turn back to liberalism. Yeah, they want a shortcut back to liberalism, to liberal society. Liberal society is dead. How can you have a liberal society when your whole society is run by super exploitation of workers? Delivery drivers from all over Asia running around for 11 hours to bring you toothpaste in the middle of the night. How is that a liberal society? These are brutal societies, harsh societies. Workers sent down into mines to bring up materials to make our phones. Brutal, harsh. Liberalism is long gone. You know, liberalism isn't a society of laws, by the way. That's insufficient. Marx critiqued that in his early youth, in his 20s. Critique of Hegel's, you know, on right and so on. The early writings, the Jewish question, those texts. Marx critiqued the idea that liberalism is a stable set of laws. The laws have to live in the world. We have to understand how they live in the world. And I don't see that thinking robustly taking place today.
Maybe there I can have a small advertisement blog, because we as KO started an education program which is designed to take 3 years. We started it a couple of months ago. And what we aim to do is to look at the history of struggle, to look at how Marx and Engels and Lenin and others developed their theories, what struggles they were involved in, what organizations they were involved in, what were the discussions, and how did they use it to further develop their theory, because of course we need to understand how they did it in order to get a proper analysis today. So everyone is welcome to join that. I want to ask one last question. I don't see any further questions from the audience, so I'll just take the space and then you can ask a... He's greedy. Okay, so we'll have one last question from me, one last question from Motashi. Unless anyone who didn't ask a question wants to ask one, feel free. Are you standing up to ask a question? No, I think he's just walking around. Okay. So, and then we'll conclude. So, my question would be, I mean, you talked about, zooming back a bit to what you started to talk about when you answered the third block of questions, about the contradictions in the global south and within the countries that kind of try to have a more independent stance. So one big question for me is the role of India, because India is part of the BRICS, but we also know that India is really, also an important ally of the West, also of Israel, often enough. There are big fights with China, and recently there was the conflict with Pakistan. So what really is India's role? I mean, probably it's too short time to answer everything, but maybe you could just give a quick overview. Is India actually the weakest chain of the imperialist, the weakest link in the imperialist chain, or is it just a weak part of the I don't know, global south anti-imperialist bloc?
Yeah, do you want to have his also?
You mentioned that there are no real Marxists in Germany or in Europe as well. Do you think, is it the result of the fall of the Soviet Union that the European left intellectually retreated? They accepted the defeat at intellectual level, at spirit level, right? So it was so shock for them what has happened. Maybe that is the reason, or what is the reason that you don't find these big giants now? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me answer the India question first, because I think the other one would be a great way to end. Yeah? Okay. Well, firstly, you know, India is a very large country, and it's 1.4 billion people. It's hard to, with India as with China, it's actually harder to say India this, India that, than with maybe a smaller country, where you could say, you know, Belgium this, Belgium that. Yeah. Very complicated, because also India, like China, is a decentralized country, which surprises people often when I say China is a completely decentralized country. The provincial governments actually have much more budgetary power than the central government in terms of disbursement of funds. And I've often interviewed people in municipal and provincial governments in China, and they always say, as long as the central government doesn't say something is off the table, we do it. We can do whatever we want as long as it's not explicitly forbidden, which I find an interesting rule of thumb. In India, it's also a republic, a federated republic. And there are very powerful states in India that have political views completely antithetical to the government at the center. For instance, Kerala, which has population of 35 million, is governed by the Left Democratic Front. Basically, the communists have ruled Kerala for the last decade. And maybe we'll win another state election. Maybe. It's not easy to say. So I just want to put that on the table, because India is really complicated. I grew up in West Bengal, which has, 70 million people. And from 1977 to 2011, it was governed by the Left Front. We had a communist government for most of my life in Bengal. I was 10 years old when the government came to power first, and then 34 years later, we lost the election. After winning 8 elections in a row, which was too many actually. We needed to lose an election so that we go back to the people. We kind of lost the habit of being with the people became too sclerotic in government. And I think that happens to a lot of governments. You know, I just want to say this, even though you know it. The DDR only lasted 40 years. You know, that's amazing. Only less than 40 years? 40 years. Yeah, 40 years. 40 years! Like, two things surprise me right now, just in my head. I'm older than Lenin was when he died. That's a shame. Haven't made a revolution anywhere. My life is useless. And secondly, I'm way older than the DDR. That's amazing. And I'm still an idiot. I still don't know a lot of things. You know, it was so young when it died. It's unfair to judge the DDR for this, that, and the other. I mean, it's so young. These bourgeois societies, Britain, they've been going at it for years and it's still pathetic. Yeah, this is only 40 years old. It's actually pretty amazing. When Leon Trotsky was in Turkey and writing his history of the Russian Revolution, he starts the introduction by saying people attacked the Soviet Union. But remember, you societies have had hundreds of years to build capitalism and you're still in the middle of a crisis. We have only had 8-10 years. Give us a break. He actually writes about the USSR as we, even though he's in Turkey. He still sees himself as part of the process. It's very interesting preface, prefatory notes to History of the Russian Revolution, which is a really very good book, even though I don't agree with everything in it. It's a really good history of the revolution. I can't believe I'm recommending a Trotsky book, but here it is, okay? Trotsky was at points a great comrade. He built the Red Army, you know, etc. I'm not a very sectarian person, although I have my limits, yeah? Gotta have limits, and there are lots of limits. Okay, so the Indian government is a far right-wing government, but it governs a country where the poverty rate is incredibly high. Probably half the population, so maybe 700 million people, struggle with forms of hunger and illiteracy. 700 million people. So if this government walks away from basic social welfare, you will have mass starvation in India. Which is why, for instance, this government remains within the BRICS. Because it realizes that the markets in Europe and the United States are insufficient for Indian goods and services. Especially services. India needs to develop service markets in Africa and Latin America. And even in China. Yeah, India does a lot of business with China despite the fact that there's a problem between the countries. There just isn't market access in the global north for India to actually enable the growth rate that would provide social welfare to 700 million people struggling, because India's right-wing government doesn't have a path to end absolute poverty in India. So they have to rely on handouts. And for handouts, you need growth to increase. So that's one. They are remaining within the BRICS. That's also the explanation for why India didn't stop buying Russian oil. Because Russian oil is way cheaper, discounted, than Middle Eastern oil. So if they started buying Middle Eastern oil, India's growth rate would decrease. And then you'd have mass starvation problems. And that's just not tolerable electorally. So India's far right-wing government is a little trapped by the political economy of India. That because India has this running saw of poverty, and because India is a formal democracy, you just can't allow 5 million people to die of hunger every year. It's a bad look. Yeah, apart from being inhumane. It's just a bad look. And so they can't afford to do that. So that's one part of the story. The other is, despite the fact that the left is weak in terms of electoral politics, the left is actually not so weak amongst the key sectors of the working class and the peasantry. So hundreds of millions of workers and peasants are organized into the left's orbit of mass organizations. So the Communist Party of India, Marxist, has a mass organization of farmers, the Kisan Sabha, which, for instance, took an open position to join BDS. Hundreds of millions of farming families associated with the Kisan Sabha The Kisan Sabha has a population way larger than Germany. And they have signed on to BDS within India. Yeah? So that's why India is in a very complicated, I don't have time to go into more on this. It's a very super complicated thing. This thing about intellectuals really interests me a lot. I have read and reread Perry Anderson's book on Western Marxism 5 or 6 times. Because I find that book extremely interesting. It's called Considerations on Western Marxism. It's very slim. It's written donkeys years ago. In it, he says something interesting at the beginning. He says the book is really quite bad in many respects. For instance, it's Marx, the Second International, and then Gramsci, Lukács, Western Marx. He jumps over Lenin. There is no way for him to integrate Lenin. Because Lenin, in a sense, is a national liberation Marxist. I agree. Like, I'm writing a book now which is about national liberation Marxism. It starts with Lenin. Goes from Lenin to Mariátegui, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, that terrain. It's completely different terrain. These are people interested in building socialism. They are not interested in theory. But what Anderson says, which is so interesting, he says, Western Marxism was born out of a rupture. It was born basically in the ashes of the German Revolution of 1919. Because revolution failed in the West, Western Marxists at that time retreat into philosophy. All the great Marxists after 1919, according to Anderson, Karl Koch, all of them become philosophers. All the way from Karl Koch to Althusser. So this long predates the fall of the Soviet Union. That in fact, apart from a few people, Ernst Mandel, few people who take the economics of the moment seriously, the political economy seriously, most of them become philosophers. Or they become people interested in politics, in political theory, like Nikos Polantzas, and so on. That's very interesting. But I agree with you. When the Soviet Union falls, the curtain comes down. And that is also the period for the rise of a new kind of intellectual. Not the great quote-unquote public intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell and so on. Liberals, actually. Sartre is a liberal, in fact. Not those kind of great liberal intellectuals which you had in Germany as well, who stood up for peace against Trident, the Edward Thompsons in England and people like that. After the fall of the Soviet, a new kind of intellectual develops. This is not an intellectual with a great oeuvre of thought. This is the media intellectual. This is the Bernard Henry Levy with the great hair and the shirt open till here and talking about how Israel is a national liberation project and how the Arabs are gross and they want to veil their women. And why would Europe stand with a civilization that wants to veil women? And look at Israel, you can be naked on the beach. That's freedom. They go on television and attract a certain opinion. Yeah? Bernard Henry Levy is the worst or the best example of this. But you have them in Germany. I don't know their names. But I put the TV on 2-3 nights ago. And there was some talk show and I saw people talking. I couldn't understand a word, but I knew exactly what they were saying. Yeah? They're all sort of, well coiffed and there's no real conversation. Thanks for being here. It's so great. I'm so happy, etc. It's complete media intellectuals. So there's not only the content that Anderson was so interested, but the form of intellectual celebrity has changed. The intellectual celebrity now is a very different character. We have to be aware of that. It's not just the form, it's the content. Yeah? When you change the form, you also change the content. I mean, look at the works of Zizek. It's comical. The work is comical. The media appearances are comical. It's all made for TikTok. It's not real anymore. He's become like a caricature of himself. Yeah, it's not real. He's like the sticker from the photograph. that you send in WhatsApp. It's not real. It's a replica of a real person. So I really feel like we have to figure out what is a Marxist intellectualism today? What is Marxism and intellectuals? What is the relationship? We go back to the whole question, the relationship of the intellectual to the movements. How do we rebuild from that rupture that takes place in the ruins of the German Revolution? How do we return the intellectual to ask questions about the working class, about building movements, about emancipation? How do we build texts that inspire middle class people to get involved in struggles with the working class? How do we inspire people who are gig workers to think about themselves in relation to other workers and not feel alienated? How do we reach those sections to knit together the vast majority that we are? Those are serious intellectual questions, sociological questions, cultural questions. I don't need another bloody book that analyzes a television show. I don't need that kind of cultural studies, that analyzes sports car racing or whatever. I need some serious shit about the workers and the peasants in our societies. What is happening to agriculture in Germany? How does the worker alliance with farmers, or what is happening to agro-business? All of this. IG Metall, what is going on? This is intellectual activity. What is a Marxist intellectual for now? That is something that your movement, for instance, needs to model. So, I agree with you. Soviet Union fall was catastrophic, okay? I was there in 1985. I feel bad. That's the only time I went to Moscow. I want to go again, but I'm a little scared. I'm called a Chinese agent by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I fear if I go to Moscow, then they'll say he's a paid agent of Russia also. And I can't take so much pressure. Being called a Chinese agent is enough for me.
Yes, thank you very much, Vijay. I think it's always, or for me at least, it's always very inspiring and encouraging to listen to you talk, because you have a way of talking about all those heavy topics that put a lot of optimism in them, and I think this is also what we need, despite of all the crisis and war and horror that we see, to never forget that as communists we need to be optimists. And there are many places of the world where we can look at and find stories of why it's the right thing to do to be optimistic. And I really encourage everyone to look at the Tricontinental website and read their dossiers. You can also get on the newsletter, I think. They really do great work. There was a dossier on Buchenwald. There was also one, I quote you now, because on the fascism conference that we were at this weekend, Vijay was talking about a dossier that he made on, or Tricontinental made on the joy of reading, and they talk about the role of education in the socialist countries. And yes, I think this really fits to our discussion here, that we all need to get educated and we need to find the joy of reading and education and learning about the world and the struggles, especially in the Global South again. And so yes, take a look at the website of the Tricontinental. We also translated one dossier on Congo. You can find it on our website in German. And you also can find some material at the info stall from Tricontinental as well as us. And I hope to see a lot of you at the rally tomorrow. Sorry, Thursday. Tomorrow you can go to Halle for a rally. Hands off Iran, hands off Palestine. Tell me the time again? 7 o'clock. At 5 o'clock from SFP Halle, yes. Okay. Thank you.